Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jamie Morgan-Besser from the Australian Red Cross National Recovery Team, and thank you again for joining us for today's webinar with Jolie Wills called Decision Fatigue, It's All Too Much. Now, I wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land in which we meet today. I'm on the lands of the Yuggera and the Turrbal people. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, today's webinar is being presented by Australian Red Cross, and Red Cross's recovery program is based upon the Australian Natural Disaster Recovery Principles and draws upon the Community Recovery Handbook, research from the Beyond Bushfires research program, as well as our own domestic and international experience. Red Cross has been supporting the recovery of rural, regional, urban and Indigenous Australian communities post-disaster since 2006. Our Red Cross disaster recovery programs are all hazard, consequence focused and work closely with our local services, all levels of government and community groups. As a result of this community-led approach, all of our recovery programs are reflective of the communities we work with. Red Cross adds value to the recovery processes through having a trusted, neutral and independent role within communities that draws upon our unique national and international network of expertise. Now, following the 2019-2020 bushfires, Red Cross is committed to a 3-year recovery program across New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland and South Australia. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I'd just like to cover a few housekeeping topics. Today's webinar is being recorded and the link will be shared with you and it will be available on our Disaster Recovery Webinar YouTube channel. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and also share it with your network. We also invite your comments and questions. So if you can look at the chat function there, please feel free to add a comment there. And I'll just type it in there and I'll either pose it to Jolie at the time if appropriate, or we'll hold it to the end of the discussion portion at the end of the event. Now, Jolie Wills is a cognitive scientist specialising in disaster recovery and workforce resilience. She has studied how the mind works under prolonged pressure, how we make decisions and how our reactions and behaviour are impacted by stress. Jolie developed and led the psychosocial recovery programming following the Christchurch earthquakes for New Zealand Red Cross and led the support for the bereaved families in Christchurch. Jolie has lived experience of challenges and opportunities of recovery from a community perspective as a survivor of the Christchurch earthquakes herself, living disaster recovery with her family firsthand. Jolie is a Winston Churchill Fellow, Leadership New Zealand Scholar recipient, an Edmund Hillary Fellow, and is also co-author of the Recovery Leadership Guide, Leading in Disaster Recovery, a companion through the chaos. Jolie is co-founder of Hummingly, where the wisdom and insights from over 100 crisis leaders, decades of experience working with people affected by a disaster, has been pulled together to create products and training to help people do well through tough times. Welcome, Jolie. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, welcome. Thanks very much for the introduction. Fantastic, Jamie, and welcome everybody. So fantastic to be here with you today. I'm really conscious that we're going to be talking about recovery, talking about the first 12 months and beyond, but whether it's fire, whether it's drought, whether it's COVID, or whether it's all of the above, in each scenario, it's really a picture of prolonged stress. Yeah. So recovery in many ways, we talk about it being an exercise in energy depletion. So if you think about it, with mass disruption, all our routines are turned on their heads, right? And our routines are the things that often save us time and brain space and energy. So having to innovate all those little details in life that would normally be really automatic, all of that takes energy. And then when you're trying to navigate new recovery services and systems, that too takes energy. Staying positive and optimistic takes energy. Looking after yourself and supporting others and managing your emotion, all of that takes energy. So if you are feeling really tired right now, then it's totally normal and to be expected, given that in energy depletion, it's all heading in one direction in many ways. But the challenge for us then is that with that tiredness and that prolonged stress, it has a real impact on our ability to make decisions and to problem solve, right? And that's a real problem because recovery involves, hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions through time that will really shape, your future and the recovery and how it pans out for everyone. So the focus for today is really on understanding decision-making in a prolonged stress environment. And really helping to set yourself up to be in the best place possible to make those decisions that will shape your future. So I do understand as an audience, I'm going to really be speaking to those that are impacted by mass disruption in one form or another. But I am conscious that there will also be, as part of the audience, those that work with impacted communities. So as much as I'm speaking to those that are impacted, my hope is that what you're hearing will also be really useful to you in your work if you're working with communities. And often, as I was myself, you sit in both camps. Yeah, so very conscious of that. Okay, I thought I'd start. Let's share the screen. I thought I'd start with a couple of pictures, actually. Bear with me one moment. Okay, there we go. So this here is a photograph of my children. For us, our disaster recovery experience started in September 2010. We live very close to that very first epicentre. So that's been just over 10 years, and we're coming up to 10 years for the February aftershock that caused loss of life and so much damage that followed. But for us, our disaster started with the September 2010 event, very early in the morning. Our lives turned upside down. So these are my children at the time. At the time, they were 6 and 10. And this is my children actually a couple of years ago. So you can see I am now by far, especially since this photograph taken, by far the shortest in my family. And life has changed a fair bit in the 10 years since earthquakes, but as part of our disaster recovery experience. But between these two photos, there are, it feels like a million decisions. You know, if you think about it, there's decisions for myself, for our family, there's decision in leading teams and the work that I was doing and developing services to support people that were impacted, and as a communities in re-envisioning our future. So, you know, you can imagine with all of these decisions through a really prolonged period of time, we get really tired, and there are so many decisions to navigate that it's no wonder we get into that territory of decision fatigue. So today I really want to take you through some of the science behind this decision making, just because I know it's so helpful to understand what's really going on underneath everything. And then we're going to get some really super practical with some tips. So a bit of science you can expect in each section, and then we're going to say, well, what does that mean for our decision making, and what are our practical go-to tips? So that's kind of the plan for the session. And I thought I'd start with, coming from a background in cognitive psychology. This graph is always one of my go-tos. It's one of the things that cognitive psychologists can do in the lab, and I promise I have never done this with anybody. I've just been my own social experiment in many ways. But what we can do is we can look at your performance in terms of your thinking, your ability to absorb information, your ability to make decisions and problem solve, and we can measure that with different tasks. We can measure that depending on your stress levels. So we can alter artificially, so we can change the amount of cortisol that you've got flowing in your bloodstream, and then we can watch and see what happens to your performance. And if you've been impacted by disaster, you like me will be your own social experiment. You'll see this playing out for yourself and those around you. But essentially what we know is that when your stress levels, so your cortisol levels, are really low in your bloodstream, we perform really poorly. So our ability to remember things, to be able to problem solve, is actually really poor. And for many, that's really counterintuitive. And we think this is because actually the world comes at us with so many demands that we couldn't put our attention everywhere. So we really have to prioritize. So in many ways, we need to have enough skin in the game. We really have to care enough about something for us to put our energy and attention to it. And so if we increase your stress levels a little bit more, so up your cortisol levels, we find that actually our performance improves. So some stress, the message around this is some stress is actually helpful. So with a bit more, so basically you've got enough skin in the game, you really care enough about something, you've got something at stake, there's some pressure going on, then we really step up to the plate and perform. This isn't necessarily a comfortable place to be. This is the place where often all our boundaries are being pushed on, we're being stretched. This is often a place of growth, but it's not necessarily comfortable, right? But it's a place where you're put to the test and you step up and you hit things out of the park, maybe individually, maybe as a family, maybe as a team at work. You think, gosh, I didn't even know we could do that. Look at what we achieved. But the challenge is, if we increase your cortisol levels further, our performance crashes. Yeah, and I mean crash. Like, it means at this point, you know, it's really difficult to remember even the simplest of things. We don't absorb information very well. Our ability to make decisions is really poor. We can't see the obvious in our decisions. Our problem solving is really impaired. So it's really helpful to just get a bit of a sense around the stress, and it's about managing stress well, and trying to find that sweet spot and understanding that actually there's a biological curve here, that when stress accumulates too much or gets too high at any point, that actually we're going to find it really difficult to make good decisions. That's really normal, and it's really biological, and it's just helpful to understand that. So my lady on the side there with her bricks, some of you may know Anne Ledbetter or may hear of her. She is a fantastic recovery mind. So just at the beginning, Jamie mentioned a Winston Churchill Fellowship. So both Elizabeth, my business partner from Hummingly, and I both have done Winston Churchill Fellowships. So some of the challenges we faced in Christchurch, you know, were just so overwhelming. And at the time we thought, this can't be it's definitely not the first disaster the world's ever had. Other people must have some insights from this and some wisdom to help guide us. And so that's part of where a lot of the information and wisdom in our products and in our training has come from, is that ability to go and speak to people all over the world and understand recovery from many different angles. But one of the first people I spoke to on my Winston Churchill Fellowship was Anne Ledbetter in Kinglake, and after the Black Saturday bushfires. And we talked about just the reality of being, living and working in recovery. And she was saying, well, it kind of goes like this. I mean, people often don't understand how long it's going to go on for, or how much of a weight that you will end up carrying. And she said, it's just helpful to people to understand it this way. She said, you know, life already throws you a lump of bricks, a whole heap of bricks already. You know, you'll be looking at your financial worries, you've got responsibilities with kids, or, you know, there'll be various things going on, maybe health issues, or just a job that's really busy. So, you know, you already have some bricks coming that you're carrying. And then an event will come along and add a whole lot of bricks to your load. And, you know, she said, but the thing is, you think it'll be for a little while, but over time, the bricks just keep accumulating, you know, as you're having to go through those services and processes, and things just curveballs keep coming your way. And so it's really interesting, you know, in thinking about why is it that we tip from that bit at the top through to heading over the bump there. I think often the cumulative nature of the stress that we face in recovery is often underestimated, and it can be quite invisible. And you may find yourself reacting to one particular brick that's put on way out of proportion to, you know, to that particular brick, but it's because actually you're carrying quite a load. I think that's just useful in thinking about that prolonged and cumulative stress and the impact it will have on our decision making. And it's just helpful to understand that that's a really biological process. And just as part of this cumulative load, it's just helpful to understand the impact of secondary stress. You know, often we think it's about the flow on of the disaster itself, but often it's a result of, the systems and the things we have to, bureaucracy we need to navigate through, and often stretch systems as well. This is quite a good quote from Sue Gunningham, who lost her partner in the Black Saturday bushfires, but she wrote a very good book called All the Days After. This is her reflection on secondary stress. And I think it's helpful just to see, actually it is always longer and harder than what people anticipate. And there's a lot that often we can't control, and there's a lot of waiting and difficult times through that journey. And just thinking about the impact of stress, when we've gone over the curve and we hit the bottom on the other side. So, you know, in terms of the impact of stress on our decision making, just wanted to show you a little tongue-in-cheek video around what it is we look like when we're in that space, in terms of how good our problem solving and decision making is. So I'll just get this going for you.
That's not good.
Oh, I don't need this. I'm already late.
Somebody will come. Anybody out there?
Do you have a phone?
No. Sorry. Somebody! Hello? There are two people stuck on an escalator and we need help. Now, would somebody please do something? I don't believe this. You gotta be kidding me.
I'm gonna cry.
Well, there's not enough left to do, is it?
Hello? Hey, don't worry about it. I'll fix it in a second.
He said he can fix it. All right. All right. That's more like it. He says he can fix it.
Walking down the sidewalk, kicking my feet as I move to the music, step to the beat. I woke up today.
All right, so it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's just a really helpful reminder that it is really normal under prolonged stress for our decision-making to be negatively impacted and our ability to see problems. It's the way that we're designed, it's our biological, we're product of our biology in many ways. And yes, so you may notice yourself or others having some of those escalator moments, and it's sort of an indication around where you're at on that stress curve and your ability to make decisions. So that stress management side and trying to do stress well is really, really important. Yeah, and I mean, it's a problem when it comes to, you know, this environment. The recovery is incredibly stressful, and yet we're having to make decisions that will shape the future of our lives. So just to be aware of what that biology looks like and trying to manage yourself to be in a good spot at the time that you're making those crucial decisions. So, you know, knowing this, what are our key tips? You know, the first thing is when you think about that secondary stress and there being a lot that comes your way that you may not be able to influence or control, thinking about with your decisions, can you put your energy and your attention on the decisions in the areas that you can control and influence? That would be my first tip. My second tip would be thinking about the fact that calm really helps. So again, it's that stress management. Can you come to a decision, you know, in a place where you're as calm as you possibly can, you know, in terms of that stress curve? Thinking about, you know, bringing your body and your brain to the best space you possibly can to be making decisions, to be able to perform well. So, you know, it's really helpful to, if you need to, like build in time to do some things in the lead up to a big decision that you know you'll find really calming, so that you can come at it with your best brain possible. And if you're having to, you know, run on decisions on the fly because, you know, things are hectic, then maybe defaulting back to an action that is really calming in the moment. So whether it's just taking a minute or two to think about your breathing, maybe to reconnect with nature, look out the window and just stop, or even just having a go-to saying that really helps center and calm you, such as I find really helpful, you know, this too shall pass. So, you know, for us, it's really about thinking about the biology of stress and trying to set ourselves up to be in the best place possible for good decision making. But so let's talk about, let's talk about now how we make decisions. We have two different ways that we make decisions. We have what we call a central route. And depending on the field in which you're in, there are different names for both of these routes. So I've put all three on both, but you'll see the reasons for these names in a second. So the central route basically is where we use our prefrontal cortex. We really give a decision all of our attention. So this is the point where we can really weigh up different options. It's a very high demand system. We're really thinking things through minutely and carefully and paying something our utmost attention. The problem is the world is coming at us with so many decisions through the day that we'd just be in overload if we use this mode all the time. And so as humans, we have a shortcut route and called the peripheral route, where we basically use factors that are peripheral to the argument, you know, so things like the opinions of others, trusted others, or really simple rules of thumb, which we call heuristics. So we often make quite split decisions, and that serves us well most of the time because we couldn't use the high intensity central system for all of our thinking. but it's just helpful to understand what are some of those shortcuts, because most of the time they will serve us well. But when it comes to recovery, we are making decisions that will have really, consequences and shape our future. So it's just helpful to understand the difference between the two. So just to give you a few examples, it's always helpful, I think. When it comes to some of the shortcuts that we use, there are so many of them. They're kind of our natural biases that help us make decisions quickly without a huge amount of thought, because we need that as a way of just getting through all the decisions we have in a day. So the first one to cover would be what we call the availability heuristic. So this is basically all about experience. We're just drawing on our previous life experience, and based on what we've experienced before, we'll make a quick decision. So basically, what can we call to mind easily? It's usually what we've experienced or we've seen happen with someone else, and we'll use that experience to really make our decision based on. The issue with that is that we're using a tiny data set often to generalize and to make really important decisions. So that's one to be aware of. It's a very natural thing. We'll just say, well, what's happened before? And we'll go with that as an approach. The second one that is really important is what we call the worldview, attitudes, or beliefs kind of heuristic. So the idea is that our worldview, it's kind of like wizardry at work. So we essentially seek out and listen to views and ideas and information that fit and conform with our current beliefs, right? We seek them out and listen to those views more than any other. We discount and reinterpret, so we'll hear differently someone else's view that doesn't necessarily fit with our worldview. It's the way in which it's like this filter that we run everything through. And what I find really interesting is if a piece of information is kind of on the fence, is ambiguous, doesn't fit in either camp, what we will tend to do is we'll take that information, we'll interpret it as being more in line with our worldview. So someone else would interpret it differently. And if we put it into our memory and recall it later, we remember it as being more fitting with our worldview than what it was originally. So we have these worldviews and beliefs that also will influence the way in which we see information and make decisions. The third one, and I'm going to cover 4, is affect. It's one of those things that we are drawn to decisions or information that make us feel good, right? To options that make us feel good. If we like a message or an option, then we see it as having more benefits than what it really does and less costs, right? So we see it as being more favorable than what it really is. If we dislike a message, then we see it as having less benefits and more costs, right? So we have this natural bias or this natural skew towards information or options that we like, and away from things that are not so good news for us in terms of how likely we think they are, or how many benefits or costs they might have. One that I find really important to disaster recovery in particular is what we call plan continuation bias. So this is the idea that when we're under stress and pressure, when we're really tired and everything's really hard, we tend to default to the easier, to the known and to the comfortable, right? Because we have so little bandwidth at this point, there's so much less cognitive space. And that plan continuation bias is one of those where we don't default or question the plan we had in place before, so the direction we were headed in life, disaster will turn a lot of that upside down, but often we will think about rebuilding our lives to what was there before. And there's a really great quote, it's really old now, but it stood the test of time, that really talks about the first plan, the default plan we often have in our mind was the way that our life was before. And everything else has to compete with that in some way. And it takes mental work to be reimagining or doing something differently. But even sometimes it's just not possible to go back to what was before. And even if it is possible, it's just really helpful to check whether what was there before is still what's best for your future. So if you think about my 6-year-old and my 10-year-old now being sort of leaving home, thinking about, the default plan being what was there before may not have worked for in 10 years' time, building the future that we want. So it may well absolutely be your default plan might be the best thing for you and exactly where you'd like to be, but it's really good to ask the question. Yeah. So thinking about these biases then that we have at play, or these heuristics, or our, you call it lazy way of thinking, but actually it's just an essential way of thinking when you're overloaded. Some tips for that, so that we're not ending sort of off track or overly influenced with biases that may put us somewhere that we don't want to be in the long run. Here's some top tips for that, so try to be alert that those biases are at play, and especially check your default plan. It may be the way to go, but just check that it still is. And really think about how can you give your decision-making process a boost, in terms of bringing some robustness, so that we're checking those biases, we're really asking the right questions, so that we're seeing things that we might not otherwise. So there are 2 resources that I know Jamie will send out afterwards. One is the Doing Well pack, which is available on the Hummingly website, but it has a whole section on decision making, questions that you can use to feel a whole lot more confident that you've given your decision a really good test from many different angles, questions that you can ask. And the second one that I know are freely available through Red Cross in Australia are the cards for Calamity, which are full of both knowledge that will help inform your decisions, but also questions that you can use to test your decision making. Just to help, we may not feel, we'll never know the right decision until later, so it's not that helpful now, but just in terms of feeling a lot more confident in the robustness of the process that you're using and testing your decisions and just being aware of those biases. So we've talked about how stress impacts our decision-making performance and strategies for that. Yeah, we've talked about mental shortcuts and biases and some strategies for that, and I'll put some tips up at the end with some summaries. But it would also be really easy to think, especially after this last section, that good decision making is all about being really rational, and logical, and not too swayed by the emotional or the biases that we have, and that we should remove emotions from the equation. So one of the very traditional ways that we've been brought up to think is that we should be thinking about logic without the sway of emotion when it comes to good decision making. So we often pit the two against each other. But is that really true, when we look at the science? So actually it's quite interesting. It's almost like we treat them like 2 different brains. You've got the rational where you ponder, where you really reflect and you analyze things, the logical brain, or you've got the emotional brain, which feels much more impulsive, it's quite powerful, and it's sometimes really illogical. So, there's these 2 kind of conflicting approaches, and we tend to favor, the logical over the emotional. And actually what we know is that we do have 2 very different neural circuitry. There are very different parts of our brain in which it's almost like having 2 minds or 2 brains, the logical one and the emotional one. And there are very different neural circuitries for those. So again, the logical one is in your prefrontal cortex, where we can mull things through our circuitry and come up with really robust decisions. We can really weigh up different options. We can think quite concertedly about things. The emotional brain, on the other hand, is in a much more primitive part of our brain, right? And it includes both the hippocampus, which is helpful for memory, and the amygdala, which is all about emotion. And we do know that basically the amygdala is scanning the environment and things that are coming all our way all the time. And it's scanning for kind of things, is this something I hate? Is this something that hurts me? Is this something I fear? Is this something that makes me feel good? So it's kind of looking for those emotional triggers that come in with all the stimuli that are coming our way as part of our world. And if it says yes, especially around the something I fear or something I hate or something that might hurt me, then it's going to telegraph crisis to our brain, right? It will do this and it will get us ready for threat without it can just shortcut the rational brain. Because if we pause and think about it, then, we may be in peril and danger. We often don't have time to do that. So the emotional brain is quite quick to take us into action if we need it. And so that it's interesting to think, okay, we pit these 2 against each other, the emotional and logical brain, but are they really, should we really be thinking about the rational part of our brain and our thinking without the pull of emotion for good decision making? Is it really like that? And what is really interesting for me as a cognitive scientist is that the amygdala part of your brain, which is, the center of our emotions, for people who've had to have that part of the brain removed for things like managing epilepsy, or have had that part of the brain injured in any way, so that emotional part of their brain, without it, they make terrible decisions, right? So it doesn't impact their IQ, but they still can't make great decisions. You know, they dither, they find it really hard to prioritize, find it really hard even just to make an appointment with a doctor. So, you know, any of these things in life become really, really difficult. Decision making becomes near on impossible. So what we have learned from this is it's not this like opposing thing between logic and emotion, that actually feelings are indispensable for rational decisions. So that we think how they work is that they're like a highlighter. So because they're scanning all the things coming in all the time, what they are doing for your rational brain, which as we talked about before, can't be giving that central processing, right? It can't be like overly thinking or everything that comes in its way, it would implode. So instead, the emotional brain is highlighting the things that it believes the rational brain needs to pay attention to and eliminating some of the other options. So it's like this highlighter or a filter. And so while it's doing that, the rational mind then takes what the emotional mind is sending it, and it kind of vetoes or refines what the emotional mind is telling it. So it's kind of like this dance between feelings and thoughts. It's not that we just need our rational mind for good decision making. We actually need our feelings and emotions as well to make really good decisions. So it turns that old dichotomy on its head. We don't want to do away with emotion when we're making decisions. It is really just about needing both the head and the heart. Yeah, the head and the rational and the emotional side of things. But what we need to do is find the intelligent balance between the two, because when emotions get really high, then we get into that space where we can't engage our rational mind. So, you know, it's just helpful to understand that actually your emotions may be highlighting things that are important to consider, and then trying to get that balance right between the two. That said, the other danger that we often have is we can fall into the trap of the super logical or the rational, because we tend to privilege what is most easily measured, you know, what is most tangible. And those are often the financial or practical things on our list. Yeah. So there are things that may be more important to someone, even if they are less tangible or less measurable. So, you know, it's really easy in the thick of recovery to have this really, your to-do list gets supersized with all your tasks, recovery related tasks, often quite practical tasks. It's the paperwork you've got to fill in, it's the financial decisions you've got to make, and so on and so on. And in doing that, it's really easy to, I'm going to flip past this one actually, it's really easy to lose sight of what is most important amongst the never-ending, you know, practical and to-do list tasks and things that we have. So it's helpful to think about what is most important to you. It's easy to get caught up in just the tangible things, and to keep what's most important to you at the heart of your decision making. And I think it's helpful too in understanding, especially if you're working with disaster impacted people, is that it makes sense then that what is most important will differ for many different people. Yeah, so only they will know. And it's keeping what is most important that you value and that you want to protect at the heart of your decision making, because it's easy to get lost in all those practical tasks that come your way. So again, that's probably the advice for that section. And then in the next section, we're heading into us as social beings, right? So we're getting a little bit out of the brain, but it's still very much thinking about decision making. Just doing a time check. Okay, so one of our decision-making myths that we have is that we often make decisions independently, yeah, or in isolation, but actually we really don't, yeah. So you'll see this is one of the cards for Calamity cards. We do constantly check in with those around us to decide what's normal, what's desirable, what information can be trusted, so what's credible. And I think knowing that, it's really important to think about the social aspect of decision making. You know, with other people, we can help generate ideas, we can problem solve, we can get a sense of perspective, right, with other people around us. And we often underestimate how important that is to our decision making. The flip side of things is that, you know, disaster is a mass collective event. You know, it's collective by nature. A whole lot of people are impacted. This has its good and its challenging sides at the same time. You know, we can use each other to bounce ideas off. We can combine resources. Yeah, we can combine voice to address challenges and advocate together, and we can really support each other. And that's hugely important to decision making and to collective recovery in communities. The flip side is sometimes we can get, especially as we all get really tired, is we can end up with a group of people who are super tired, scratchy, and in that kind of stressed brain space. That's really normal too. So thinking about the social aspect of decision making, some sort of practical tips would be make sure you do have a social crew, a support crew for your decision making. You want a mix of people, yeah, and you can task them with things like just to listen, perhaps, or to ask really good questions, or to be a sounding board for you, or to generate ideas. So you can sort of task them different ways. And the second practical tip is just to check every now and again, look around you occasionally and check to see if those that are your support crew or helping advise you or work through decisions with you, are they still really great for giving perspective, and are they still a helpful reference point? Yeah, sometimes we'll need to mix it up, and it's really helpful to have others that are in a similar situation to you, and maybe others who have been there before. But just to keep checking in to see, we use people around us to help us with perspective, and when we're all in that dip at the bottom of the recovery curve, we were all really tired, then it's always good to think, okay, is this crew still, the right group of people, the mix of people for me? Just check that through time. Okay, the other challenge I think with the collective, mass disruption event is collective decision making too. It's not just about your own individual decisions, it's often about collective decisions in communities. So I just want to acknowledge that this makes it even more difficult, because many of these decisions are collective in recovery. And in that case, you have so many different people with their own different compasses, their different priorities all at play. And so for that reason, we've got a facilitator's guide that can be used with the cards for Calamity. So Jamie has that available that she can send out after the webinar. So again, the cards for Calamity are freely available through Red Cross. But they're a sort of guide with a whole lot of activities to really support some of these collective community conversations and decisions, because we know from experience that it's not easy, but actually it's really important, and that collective power in community is quite amazing as well. Okay, so just thinking about some very final tips, because I know I've covered a huge amount in that time. So I just want to come back to some final tips from a bit of a summary, really. The first one is to set your body and brain up to make the best decisions possible with as much calm as you can. Is this the right time for making this decision right now? Am I in the right space? What can I do to come to this decision in the right space? What are my go-to kind of calming things that really help me? The things that you enjoy that you might want to make sure you do beforehand. Secondly is really remembering what is most important and keeping that to you and keeping that at heart of your decision making. Stay connected, really build that support crew. It's really important to our decision making is having people that we can retain perspective with or bounce ideas off or just have as a soundboard, or maybe collectively band together to advocate if you have common challenges. I think it's really helpful to view decisions from as many different angles as you can. So the power of questions is really important. So that helps with many of those biases as well. The biases that we bring. Asking questions will help make sure that we have a bit more rigor in our decision making, which links to this point here, is make use of the resources that we have to support your decision making. So again, the list of resources will come out after the webinar, but these resources are really helpful for testing your decisions or for asking questions and just guiding. Your decision making is only you know what is best for you, but it helps give you some great questions to run your decisions through. And lastly, really important is just to be really, really kind to yourself. From experience, I know that if you're finding this decision making and this prolonged stress and all the decisions that are coming your way, if you're finding it's hard, it's because it is, And that just doesn't, it just means you're human if that's how you're finding things. It is difficult, yeah, and it is hard and it is complicated. So be really kind to yourself. I think take heart that with any decision that you make, that you're doing the best you can with the information that you have at the time. That's all we can ask of ourselves really at the end of the day. And it's just helpful to understand, you know, some of what's going on behind the scenes and some of the resources that we can help make decision making just that little bit easier. So yeah, go easy on yourself. All right, I'll shut down my screen so I can see you all again. Great. Now I can see some comments and things.
Thanks so much, Jolie. So much of what you said, I can imagine, is resonating with some of our participants in the webinar, especially those ideas of, gosh, it is just too hard. Like it just feels overwhelming and I'm never going to see the end of this recovery journey. And I guess our message is that it is really hard. We see that and normalizing that that difficulty, but there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Absolutely. And it's, you know, it's as hard as it is, it's all about making it just that little bit easier. Yeah, and accessing a lot of that information and wisdom from others who have been there to help make it a bit easier. Yeah.
That's a really really important part. And Cherie's actually got a question around the cards for Calamity, which we can obviously send people when they get in touch with us. So we can get you a address and send them off to you and get you in touch with your local recovery officer. But she also asks, are the cards for Calamity available as a book, or do you have another resource that you could recommend?
It's a great question, Cherie. Actually, the Cards for Calamity started as a book, right? So Elizabeth and I were working at this point, it was post Christchurch, and we were working in different disasters in different places around the world at that point. And she was in one part of the world and I was in another. And we were sending, again, based on all of this research and our sort of decades of collectively, we were sending these messages backwards and forwards to each other by WhatsApp, you know, middle of the night type stuff. And between us, it was a lot of the, what had people been telling us they wish they'd known? What are the really useful messages that people find helpful? And based on that, we started writing a book. And then, you know, I'm a cognitive scientist, so I also know how, and from my own experience, how little we can actually absorb when we're in that kind of space. So we got sort of probably 90% the way through writing the book and then thought, what are we doing? I wouldn't have had time to read a book, you know, at this point. I mean, I know some people, you know, do, and that's their go-to, but at the time I'm thinking, how do we make a lot of this information just that little bit more accessible in bite-sized pieces? And so it turned from a book into the Cards for Calamity, just pulling out the main messages and stories. So the answer is no, but that's where it came from a book into the set of cards.
I wonder, that's very interesting, because some of good to know, because some of the other questions were, what are the Cards of Calamity? This is very, very interesting. I wonder if you could do just show us a couple of examples, Jolie. So this is the Hummingly resource that Red Cross has worked with Hummingly to get a good supply of, so that we can actually provide them to people who want them. And you can actually access them by emailing us at recovery@redcross.org.au. But again, everyone who's registered for these webinars will be sent an email with the links to this webinar as well as all of the resources attached. So you can just reply back to that email and just say, yep, I want a copy and this is my address, and we'll work with your local recovery officer to get you a batch.
Yeah, and everything, they're a mix between some of the research and science that we know. So this here is a bit of a graph around what you can expect, you know, and it's never this neat and tidy, but a bit of a map around, you know, what is typical in terms of the dip at the bottom of the graph that we talk about, where everyone gets pretty tired. Yeah. And then at the end here, we end up with, for a majority of people, we end up with growth, or that's not everybody's experience, but actually as much as this time in the bottom is tough and you feel like you're headed downhill, actually it's helpful to know that more than 50%, and probably a good estimate is about 70, because a lot of studies say 90 something, will grow as a result of going through this really tough stuff. It doesn't make this bit any easier, but it's helpful to understand some of that. So some of it's, you know, the science research base, others kind of wee stories. And I'll just read this one from Denmark. This is from Per, who went through, you know, a storm and has had to rebuild his home after the sea inundated his home. But after the disaster, I knew my body and mind were kind of out of order. I started accepting I could not operate at 100%. I thought, if I'm at 70%, then what is reasonable to expect of myself? I stopped making too many arrangements. I kept business conversations short because I wouldn't remember the details of a long call. It helped a lot just to accept that it was a natural reaction, it's normal, and it got better with time. And then a lot of these cards have questions to help. This question, are you being too hard on yourself or on others? So some of them are tips, some of them are, a little bit of science. We've got tips for bureaucratic nightmares. We've got everything through to this is one of my favorite ones, the mosquito quote from the Dalai Lama. So this one says, use the quote below when you're feeling a lack of power and control, because we know that's a real feature. Recovery is a collective effort. A lot of citizens doing little things will make a big difference. Everybody brings something different to the effort. You might be a kind listening ear. You might be able to explain an assistance grant. You might be handy with a hammer. And then the quote from the Dalai Lama is, if you think you're too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito. And the question is, what is going to be your little thing? So there's a real mix here between practical and inspirational, and just access to some of the knowledge around recovery that is helpful to people.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much, Jolie. One of the questions is how do people use them? So it's a matter of just picking up a card and having that wonderful sense of wisdom from people who have gone through those experiences previously, or what are your thoughts about the best ways to use them?
So there is a facilitator's guide that will come out as one of the resources that come through, but they're useful just for individuals and families. Just one of those things to have on your nightstand, and what will speak to you at different times of recovery will change depending on the challenges that you're facing. So it's good just to have a bit of a reset, or to use the cards for inspiration or a pick-me-up, or just to go to if you're struggling with a particular challenge. But in terms of using them in groups, there's lots of ways that they can be used in groups and with others, and even just we have people who are doing walk and talks where they might have a set each, and they in COVID in particular, they were in isolation, so they would pick a card each that was relevant to them at the moment, and they would use it as a chance and an excuse to connect, and they would speak on the phone to each other, and they'd both walk at the same time. They'd go for their weekly walk, and they'd pick the card that they picked, and we'll talk about why. So it's amazing how in collective kind of settings where you're with others, how you can really get quite deep in a positive way into some of the challenges and things that people are struggling with, really help with some of that social support for each other.
Thanks heaps, Jolie. One of our attendees has confided that I'm finding that it's a year this week in regards to the anniversary. I'm crashing now. I work in the environmental sphere. I'm scattered and stuck. What sort of advice or tips can we support this attendee with?
Okay, can you ask the question again? It's a year at the moment.
So it's with regards to the anniversary. I'm finding that it's a year this week since their event that significantly impacted their lives. I'm crashing now. I work in the environmental sphere. I'm scattered and stuck. How do we support this person with tips or hints around feeling unscattered and unstuck? What could we be supporting this person with?
I think the first thing is to know that that's often a really normal space to be feeling in at about now, and that be kind to yourself is a really important message. And often in that year you've been going so hard and racing so hard, there's often not a lot of downtime, and you can for a while put on hold a lot of the things that we talked about it being an energy depletion exercise, and we often put on hold our health basics or our relationships or the things that give us energy and bring us joy. We put all that stuff on hold because it feels like the situation demands it. But the challenge is that it just keeps going. So after a year, you often have put a lot of that stuff on hold. And you can do it for a bit without there being, ramifications of that. But, after a while, all of that catches up. So I think one is to know it's normal. Two is to really put in as much plan in place for yourself as you can, plans to really think about, that rejuvenation, that catching up with people that really care about you, the having some time to top up your tank, I think, and just some space to process and to feel what is coming your way at the moment. And then lastly, reach out. Don't be afraid to reach out and connect with someone, because actually it's really normal, I think, at this stage of things. Any help's a good thing.
Thanks so much, Jolie. Esther also asks, often people going through the recovery process talk about the brain fog or the disaster brain, so to speak. What tips do you have around challenges for memory?
So, as Per said, it's about, maybe managing your expectations a little bit, around actually we have so much more being demanded of us, but how do we prioritize and sort of be realistic with our expectations for ourselves? All those memory aids are helpful. I wouldn't have done without pen and paper. Like, honestly, I think I look back and think I don't even remember that conversation. So, really helpful with any of those memory aids, especially if you're going through recovery processes or services, is to try and write down as much as you possibly can. And I think the biggest thing is to really get to that stress management stuff, because it's an indication of our where we're at and where our brains are at. It's hard to do in the thick of things, but if you can, just try and carve out 5 or 10 minutes to sit under a tree and just put your engine back to idle whenever you can, just to try and move out of that sort of overly stressed state into a place where, I've noticed here, Louis, I think, is talking about eustress. Yeah, and that's that beautiful green spot at the top where some stress is actually helpful to us, but actually recovery often throws us with that cumulative load over the hill and down the other side. And it's about how do we find ways to recognise that that's our brain saying it's hit overload, and how do we give it some space and a bit of rejuvenation time.
It does seem really counterintuitive, doesn't it, to slow down in order to really help yourself reset and move forward a little bit more unstuck, so to speak.
I didn't say, actually, when you've gone down the other side and at the bottom there, it's, your performance is no longer connected, to, your performance crashes as a result of your stress levels, but it's no longer connected to your effort. So at that point, you're probably running twice as hard, trying extra hard to get a result, and wondering why it is you're less effective and less efficient. And at that point, this is the time when people might tap you on the shoulder and say, look, I think you need to take a break. And you're like, I can't, I've got too much on, no chance of taking a break. But actually we've become less than effective at that point. And it's really hard to hear some of those messages when we need them most. Yeah, it's about slowing down to speed up, which seems crazy.
Thanks heaps, Jolie. And the final question that we've got, unless other people wanted to pop that in the question bar there, is if starting to implement a significant life decision is creating anxiety, does that indicate that it is the wrong decision, or is it just pointing to something else that needs attention?
So it may not mean it's the wrong decision, but I think sometimes it's helpful to listen to that anxiety and try and work out where it comes from. Sometimes the anxiety is that it's just actually we've had so much change, and this may be a necessary change, but honestly, I just, am worried about this being one more change. I think it's, again, the emotions being a highlighter, telling us to listen and see if there's anything that we need to hear at this point. So it may be that that's highlighting something else that you need to focus on, or something else about it that you haven't considered underneath. When it comes to decisions, we can be quite surface level, and really getting to is there something here that I need to work out or listen to and take into account with my decisions. There is one slide I skipped over, and I'll just see if I can find it in here. And it's around the fact we do tend to focus a lot on our practical or our financial, the things that we can measure and that are really tangible. And there is, if I can find it, it'll be the last one I find through here, I can guarantee. There is one that we call the capital calculator. But actually it's that idea that when you're making a decision, it's really easy for someone from someone else's perspective to go, well, actually, this is what I do. But we all come at it with different levels of resources in our tank, and the different, here we go. I don't know if you can see that one. Okay, so we call it the resource calculator, and I'll read it, but do a stock take of the resources you have in all aspects of your post-disaster life. Give yourself a score out of 5 for each resource. How strong do you feel in each area? This is a good exercise to do with your partner or friend, so you can discuss the scores, understand where each is coming at, and support each other. Because often, what feels like the right decision for you might feel quite different, and yet you've got the same information. It might also impact when and what decisions you make, right? So we've got along here social, financial, emotional, spiritual, and physical. So it might be, some decisions are actually, it's going to take, you're going to need quite a lot of physical capital in the tank. You're going to need a bit of fuel for that to play out. For others, it's like, okay, yes, I would do this if I had a, my spiritual or social tank topped up, but given what that might cost right now, I don't know if that's a good option. So again, just thinking about our different decisions, there's often more at play than just what we see in front of us. So thinking of it from different angles, and that's often where others can ask us questions that can be quite helpful.
Bring a new perspective, perhaps.
Yeah.
Fiona's just got a question here around talking about feelings. What is your gut feeling? Is it emotions?
Yeah, that's our emotional brain at work. Yeah, often, and that's where sometimes you weigh up and people say, I've got to listen to the gut. And again, it's good to ask questions around that. What is this trying to tell me that I might otherwise ignore if I just went with irrational? Yeah, try and put that as part of the equation. Yeah.
And also Bob's asked, we have many people here who have been in multiple and near constant disaster recovery loops since February 2019 and are dealing with the mental health cost of being in that mode for so long, so that high cortisol. How do we talk to people whose worldview is that there is nothing but disaster and post-disaster or recovery is a pipe dream?
And this is the challenge, because actually our world is headed in the way that we are going to have, like disruption more often. And I think we often think that once we've had a disaster, life goes on hold and that's all we have to deal with. But often, there'll be other curveballs that come your way as well. So I think in that instance, it's about, each event or each challenge will, it sounds really trite to say it, but will prepare us for some of the things that will come later. In many ways, we will learn, and often the hard way, but we will learn a lot of things through each event. We learn skills, we become closer to others, or we learn about our own strength, and we can apply that to future events. The challenge is when you haven't had time to go through that sort of recovery process and be able to process and to get to the point where you can realize and acknowledge those strengths. If you get to that good place, then you are much better prepared to go into the next event. The challenge is when the next event layers on, when you still haven't got to that growth point, and it's kind of one thing on top of another. So I think it's just acknowledging how challenging and hard that is, for people. And and it's hard. We talk about trying to find a way to hold both the pain and the possibility, because if you go too quick into talking about growth and opportunity, when people have just had layer on layer and layer, it can be what's the word? They can be really disillusioned by that. So it can be quite alienating. So I think it's just about acknowledging people where they're at and how hard it is. And then, hope is important. I think trying to take them towards, we often actually with the cards for Calamity, we have some collective exercises where we talk about, spending a set amount of time really thrashing out, giving people the opportunity to talk about, how challenging it is and the emotions that come with that, because that's all very real and it is part of the journey and part of the healing. So allowing people to feel and be acknowledged for the fact that they have had multiple things on top of each other is really difficult. And then creating space to go, okay, well, based on that, what ideas do we have, or collectively, how can we support each other? So kind of moving from, once people really have had time to have their realities acknowledged, thinking about, is there opportunity here for action or support or ideas, and trying to move towards that idea space if possible.
Thank you so much, Jolie. A couple of last questions and comments just before we wrap up here. Louis confides that they've had 3 deaths and major medical events in their family, change of residence, pack and unpack of homes, and then COVID-19 and a change of work department over a period of 4 years. Finally, finding things he's put up on hold have finally caught up with him, unable to be productive now at work, from home, and decisions take a while to happen each day. I feel stressed day and night. I think your talk has shown me where I am.
And I think it's helpful to know that that space can become normal once it goes on for too long, but normal not in a helpful way, right? And normal in a way where we just keep depleting the resources in our body and in our lives. And I think it's, whatever you can at this point. One is be really kind on yourself. And the second thing is to really get into the mode and to get supports around you and to try and set your life up as best you can to start rejuvenating some of that, and just knowing that that's going to take some time, to top up all of those balances.
What are the signs, one of our attendees asks, what are the signs that you need help from outside? I've never been in this situation before.
I'd always go for it earlier rather than later, yeah. But that said, most people will get through. And I think the signs that I tend to go for is, you know, so most reactions that you will have will resolve with time, but if it's starting to feel like it's too much, or it's gone on for too long, or you're feeling stuck, those would be the kind of things. Or if others around you are noticing and worried about you, that'd be sort of the ones that I would go to. I found it helpful to have a bit of a rule that actually, so for me, you know, when things get too much, I don't sleep well. And if I have a night like that, then that's okay. But if I had 3 nights in a row, that kind of was my rule for just picking up the phone proactively and talking to someone about whatever was stuck in my head. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Our final question here, well, thank you very much, Jolie. This has been great. That's the comment. Through past experience, do you believe personally your resilience at times of new disasters allows you to cope well or causes greater distraction concerns?
Do you mind reading that one again? Sorry.
Yep, not a problem at all. Bear with me just a second. I'll just get that back up for us. Through past experiences, do you believe personally your resilience at time of new disasters? So with people with the upcoming disaster season, as an example, people are getting a little bit anxious about what that might mean. Do you feel that the resilience allows you to cope better, or your experience of your past event that changed your life allows you to cope well or causes greatest distraction concerns?
Right, no, I understand now. It's a mixed bag, I think. You know, for most people, again, if you've had that time to process and to really have done the learning and the healing, then I think you typically come at it, you know, a lot stronger and, you know, with all sorts of skills and resilience. I think if it's a layer on top of stuff that you're still dealing with, it can just make your load of bricks a whole lot heavier. And I guess it's mixed like anything. You know, I think about, so for example, I look at my children and I think, I see impacts as a result of the earthquakes. I can see how they may be change resistant, or there are you know, some hangovers from it. But on the flip side, I also see how much more empathy they have, how much more prepared they are for life. So, you know, as much as we talk about growth, it's kind of like it doesn't have to be either or. You might have a bit of both. So it might come with some anxiety, and you know, but also you may come with a kit of skills that you didn't have before. So it might be a bit of a mixed picture.
Thank you so much, Jolie. I really appreciate your time and energy and effort today. Why we might actually wrap up there, and again wanted to say to everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for today's session. Just a reminder that this webinar was recorded, and we'll send you through a link to the recording along with all of the resources mentioned in today's session. So specifically around the cards for Calamity, please feel free to email us at recovery@redcross.org.au if you'd like to get a pack of that, and we'll send that out to you. This was one of a series of webinars, so please keep an eye out on the Red Cross website. Now, just a reminder that the information contained in this session is made available by Red Cross in good faith to provide general information about some issues that people may face after a disaster. But of course, we strongly encourage individuals to seek advice about their particular issues they're facing from a suitably qualified professional, such as a GP, a registered clinical psychologist, or your community health service. As I mentioned, if you are interested for further information on our recovery program, please feel free to email the National Recovery Team at recovery@redcross.org.au. Thank you so much again for joining us. Until next webinar, thank you and goodbye. Take care.